The important part about the hermit crab monologue is not the initial paragraph, which is basically, as you described, also something to do with how hogs eat frogs and men eat hogs.
Yeah.
But it shows that Big Frank is aware of what he's saying too. This isn't some just offhand poesy that he's speaking about. He is aware of what he's saying. He understands it. Big Frank is one of the few characters in the book that seems to be able to get outside of himself and kind of plan omnisciently in that sense, which is why he gets over on Polly, because he can see both outside himself and outside of Polly's world.
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to speak about this too because these are some of the larger, grander moments in the book, but the book is equally adept at getting the smaller moments. At one point, I believe it's after Tony Luff's, or right before Tony Luff's final Christmas montage of sorts, he goes outside of his apartment and he's on the fire escape, and you get the smell of the rusted fire escape from him. That's a little moment that nevertheless puts you right in his purview that way. Those are the little moments that are also in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, but A Tree Grows in Brooklyn was not nearly as experimental as this book is.
Well, I mean, yeah,
Talk about these little moments.
that's one of the things too. I always like to have, especially at the beginning and ends of chapters. I was just speaking with an actress today, and on a number of my actor interviews that I've done with people, I've talked about the little moments in films being where great actors really strut their stuff, rather than the Oscar
Yes.
reel scenes where someone's in a hospital and the mother's dying, or they're breaking up with a lover, or this or that. That holding something back is often the thing. And so there are those scenes, and some of them are stretched to grand Shakespearean heights, like the sneakers scene. Others of those are things like you had talked about earlier, the last time we talked about a scene where two of the characters, the priest and Tony Luff, in the confession booth, and one of them farted, and there's something more than two men in the booth. But we're not talking necessarily about the fart or the odor. They both are hypocrites in a sense. So that's one of the things too. Is oftentimes, if you read uh, books or writers that people often say, claimed, the morals of most Russian novelists, for example, or Ayn Rand. A lot of the stuff is very heavy-handed because they have to say exactly what their personal philosophy is. And there are certainly times in books or in poems when I've directly turned to a reader and stated something, or had a character state something. But on the other hand, it also makes for pretty bad prose 99 times out of 100. So having these little scenes that takes someone out of something. One of my favorite quote unquote little scenes, although you could say it's a major dramatic moment for the characters, is earlier in the book where Sonny Liston is approached by one of the goons from the Foundation. And we get an insight into Sonny Liston, that between the two major scenes that he has of the two fights with Cassius Clay, there's this little scene where he's approached by the Foundation guy. And we get an insight into a character that we don't really need to know anything more about Sonny Liston. He's the most well-developed of the black characters in the book. There's a Foundation guy who's developed. There's the Johnny Mathis kidnap scene and a few other minor characters. But those scenes are not only to give a character and to a little breather dramatically, but it's also to give a sense of that world. Um, in this book that I'm doing now, a science fiction book, I have to do that because I have to project the world that's an eon and a half in the future. Uh, but I also have to be wary that if someone reading this book in 500 or 1,000 years, things that you and I take for granted, like who Andy Warhol and Truman Capote are, they may be long forgotten in 1,000 years. That you have to give them the care, even as tertiary or quaternary level characters, as you would to primary or secondary characters, because as I said, in the year 2800, who knows if Truman Capote is going to be a little bit more than a minor 20th century writer. And so they're not going to know his status as a homosexual in 20th century America, uh, uh, and how he has some political or artistic input to quote unquote gay artists of now. So you have to give a sense of who he is, even though his one appearance is kind of outrageous. You get a sense of the man's petulance and his bigotry and his small-mindedness and his just plain nastiness and competitiveness with someone like Warhol. And that gives the character, even though he's a fictionalized version of a real character, something to latch onto other than him being, oh, he was that 20th century writer. No, someone in 2800 who may never have read a Truman Capote book will say, oh, I remember that character, Truman Capote. He was based on a real guy. And there was that scene where he said this and that. And it'll give an added dimension that will give the book resonance, just as now I have to, to limn a very complete world set in the future. Those people who are in that future to come, looking back, are going to have to know something about it. The same way that Melville uses his intercalary chapters about whaling to give a fuller picture. Instead of my having intercalary chapters or chapters like the legend teller stuff from Tumbleweeds, I do it within these little small moments that say, oh, here's how a lonely guy, Luft, for example, might be spending a night alone with a major holiday coming. What does he feel like? And even though he's a dope, and even though he's a killer, and he's a bad human being, you should be able to feel a little bit of something for him.
Yeah, I would describe your prose as amorphous, though, because the little moments kind of have different functions. It's sometimes contrast and transition too that serves the purpose instead of just getting you out of the narrative for that moment. The Sonny Liston moment is a good example. There's a moment where Norwegian is looking at waves and thinking philosophically about them, whereas with Sonny Liston he doesn't see anything like that in those waves. There's plenty of other sequences where a character just simply closes his eyes, like Tony Luft, and then opens them, and it's fantasy instead of the real world that he sees. These are great little moments that move the narrative along too, instead of simply taking you out of the narrative, which is why your prose kind of is very flexible that way. I wanted to speak to, as we're going along here, of the eventual murder of Polly Maravelli, unless you had anything that you wanted to speak about before.
No, go ahead.
So, his eventual murder, and there's plenty of scenes where Big Frank is preparing for it, is done in by the Norwegian in not the way that was originally presented in Tumbleweeds. It was the Diamond Brothers Gentlemen's Club, correct? That in Tumbleweeds it's made to seem as if he was shot repeatedly, whereas the Norwegian simply goes to him and sticks him in the base of his skull.
Yeah.
And this brings him down. But there's a
and then they take Paulie's corpse, sit him back when the guys come in, so that they blow off his head, so that any evidence of how he really died is gone.
Yes, but there's a great moment before that too, and I think that you got this from the Yasuo Uzu film, Late Spring, where he's peeling an apple. It may be a granny's apple, but it's a green apple. And as he's peeling it, he noticed that his fingers aren't nearly as strong as they used to be. They have no dexterity, even though they did so in middle age. And he puts the apple down to again make a call, and that's where the Norwegian rushes up and murders him. As that happens, the apple falls and the peel falls. That's an exact scene that is used in Late Spring, but for completely different purposes, and means two completely different things. I wanted you to talk about that, of kind of inverting the meaning of things like these symbols. And did it come from Late Spring?
Well, yeah, that's a famous scene. Now, no, and anyone who by that time has read the book is going to, and who knows anything about world cinema, will know that that's a famous scene. And there, the father is alone, and he's just wedded off his daughter. He's had a great speech about the need to construct happiness. Happiness just doesn't come. And it's got this great Shishu Ryu playing the father, and Setsuko Hara, great Japanese actors, playing the daughter, and it's filled with meaning. And so here you get sort of the opposite. Instead of life going on despite loneliness, everything finally catches up to him, and the elaborate, very Norwegian-like thing that he says about I forget the actual phrase even that opens the novel.
Says the May.
Yeah, right, and that closes it. It's a kind of irony, and Paulie knows that it's coming. And Paulie, early on, I think there's a scene where Paulie has the first glimmers of doubts about having let Big Frank, because some of the things Big Frank says about how what happened to the three other guys and how they got killed. One of the other mob bosses, I think it's one of the Patriarcha family, has some doubts, and they're questioning Big Frank, and Paulie seems to sense that something's a little bit off there. That Big Frank may have been off his game at the very least, if not doing something. And then at the end, we get the sense that Paulie knows that Big Frank has betrayed him, even though he doesn't necessarily come out right and say it. He says Big Frank. Is he saying Is he calling for Big Frank because he wants Big Frank to save him? Is he calling Big Frank to point the finger at him? At this point, Paulie has no idea that Big Frank has just killed his soon-to-be ex-wife.
He says you. He does not say Big Frank.
Oh, he does? Okay.
He says you, and that's actually, you may have been misremembering that, because in a later sequence, they go over of the possible things he could have said, and Big Frank would have led to too many ambiguities, whereas you fits in perfectly with the moment.
Yeah.
There's also a funeral sequence afterwards where you take the prose from Norwegian. By the way, before I get to that, I am skipping one part that's very important. The Norwegian looks into Paulie's eyes as he's dying, or even as he's dead, and he sees a story in it, and it's a story from, I believe, Newtown, with the kid on the bus with Paulie Marabelli, and he kind of sees himself and empathizes with the child. That's a very interesting use of an old used story, and it really ups the technique used in Vincetti Brothers, which similarly uses previous novels and stories to its benefit towards its end.
Yeah, and I don't doubt. I mean, like I said, I may have misremembered something, and that's this is 2 years since I've actually written the book, and I haven't gone back and reread it because I'm busy writing other stuff. But that's one of the things that's good to do this because when I did my spy book, I redid the whole encounter with the spy and the Norwegian, but from the spy's perspective, and we see things are quite different there, and that's the way it should be. So
it displays the fact of how this book works on memory, even to its creator. So you get a lot out of it that way, and there's plenty of scenes where I think every reader will kind of confuse other things with others just because of the grandeur and the length of the book. Okay, so afterwards, then we get the funeral scene that I spoke of before.
Just one thought. Hold on.
Sure.
And if you've ever watched Once Upon a Time in America, there's the ending of that Sergio Leone film where the Robert De Niro character is shooting up or smoking heroin or something, and we wonder if everything is a dream. And so there's a lot of that in that book too. Not only Bit's acid trip, but the ending and how things come back seemingly in a circle within the novel there. So a lot of that in a sense too was another reference point that is kind of oblique, not as obvious as like the Ozu reference you just mentioned. But that was another film that was strongly in the back of my mind, and the ending of that film, Once Upon a Time in America.